Good evening, everyone. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianships on the lands on which we're meeting today. I pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue their cultural and spiritual connections to country. I recognise their valuable contributions to the practice of caring and active management of our places, our habitats and our communities. And I hope we learn from their values and experience and expertise. I'd also like to start by acknowledging colleagues from across all of you from the built environment and planning profession that are here tonight, so especially PIA President Shannon Batch. Shannon will give us a wave. Come on, Shannon. Yes, down the front. I'd also like to welcome all our PIA Life Fellows, our fellows and members. A big shout out to my colleagues from the University of Queensland. Thanks for hoofing it in to share this beautiful room. And to the UQ alumni in the long room tonight, thank you very much for coming. A special shout out, because I can see you here, to the young planners and the emerging built environment professionals that are here tonight, and the citizens who are genuinely interested in the planning that shapes our city. So my name is Stephanie Wyeth and I'm the planner in residence at the University of Queensland, and it's a great privilege for me to be hosting tonight and being your MC. And as many of you, so I recognise some faces from last year as well. So tonight, UQ, the University of Queensland, is delighted to be supporting the 2023 Keeble Lecture, which is our premier public event around planning and the built environment. And so tonight's event is actually an annual lecture that's organised by the Planning Institute of Australia in honour of Lewis Keeble. And we're very lucky tonight. We've actually got people in here who experienced or were taught by Lewis Keeble. Maybe you want to put your hand up. Yes. I heard some stories about him earlier. But anyway, so Lewis Keeble, for just fact-checking, was the first professor of the new Department of Regional and Town Planning at UQ in 1971. So quite some time ago, and he played a seminal role in teaching town planning in Queensland. So it's been around for a while. So he arrived here in 1968. And the Keeble Lecture is hosted each year to honour his contribution to provide a platform for engagement with the wider community around issues in relation to town planning and the city. And there's a lot of those that we all need the opportunity to discuss. So I did hear some things about Lewis Keeble. So you know how we sort of think, oh, we venerate them, we think they're amazing. I heard he was pretty boring. So I'm not sure how many people want to put their hands up they stayed awake during his lecture or not. So that's not the case anymore. Universities are dynamic places and lecturers are excellent communicators. So yeah, there's some nods there going on there. So before we kick off, I've got a couple of people I'd like to introduce and bring up. So I'll introduce Shannon Batch, who's the President of the Planning Institute of Australia, to make some brief remarks.
Thank you, Steph. And good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I'd like to echo Steph's warm welcome to our special guests, our fellows, our life fellows, members, and also particularly to the people who aren't planners but have still taken time out of their day to come and share in the discussion tonight. The Keeble Lecture, Steph's talked a little bit about Lewis Keeble, and the lecture in his honour provides a fabulous opportunity for planners to come together with the broader community and hear perspectives on contemporary issues of relevance to planning, to city making, to the built environment. And I think we're in for a treat tonight with Greg. It's also fitting that in addition to being Halloween, yes, I think we might be missing a few people to trick-or-treating, but today is also the United Nations World Cities Day. We do try and align our Keeble Lecture with a day that has some alignment with planning. And it's a day that recognises and celebrates the role of cities and the role that they play in sustainable development. Now, cities, they're engines of economic growth and innovation, and they're at the coalface, I believe, of today's some of our most complex challenges. but they're also home to millions of people across the world. And the challenges and the changes we face in our urban areas, particularly in our cities, are significant. And I think we all know that change can feel a little bit uncomfortable at times, and as an industry we are feeling those growing pains in various ways as we respond to population growth and of course the ever-present housing crisis. And they will continue to be there for, I think, the foreseeable future. And while we address them and seek to address them through lasting solutions, it's going to require a lot of collaboration across all levels of government, the private sector, the community, which is why it's fantastic to see so many people from across our really broad membership base and friends of the Institute here tonight as well. Now, across his career, I suspect that Greg has worked directly or perhaps indirectly in addressing some of these growing pains, from his time at the state government and the private sector through to his most recent role, I'll say planning adjacent role at City of Moreton Bay. And the teams that Greg has led and worked with have been at the coalface of anticipating and responding to urban change. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Greg tonight and his reflections as a lapsed planner, although it doesn't look like you've actually escaped us really that far, so perhaps not so lapsed. But I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Greg, and I do believe that we have Mike Kaiser in the room. Wonderful. I just wanted to check that before I brought you up on stage. We also have Mike Kaiser, so he's the Director General of the Department of State Development, Local Government, Infrastructure and Planning, and he's one of our special guests tonight, and another really important stakeholder in these growing pains that we're experiencing and hopefully solving those. So Mike, can I invite you to the stage to make a few remarks?
Hey, thank you very much for the opportunity to make some introductory remarks. I'm super conscious that I'm standing between you and the main star tonight. I'm just the warm-up act, so I won't speak for too long, I hope. Look, it's been 12 months since I attended my very first Keeble Lecture, not long after becoming the Director General of the Planning Department and the Department for many other things. In that 12 months, it's fair to say, I've learned an awful lot about planning. It's been a big year in two respects in particular. There's two trends I just wanted to quickly call out that I think have really accelerated during the course of the last 12 months that we're very focused on within the department. The first is rapidly changing attitudes to global warming. I think that's actually changed and accelerated even just in the last 12 months. And in particular, the realisation that the global trend to clean energy is actually a real opportunity for Queensland, particularly regional Queensland. Secondly, there's been a growing awareness and maybe even some alarm about the return of extraordinary population growth to Queensland, but particularly southeast Queensland. And I like to say that's a nice problem to have. It comes with its challenges, but growth sure beats the alternative. Both of these trends have had a big influence on the work of the department and our planning division in particular. We like to say we're the department that Queenslanders can rely upon to think ahead and act now to secure responsible economic development and livable communities. That's our purpose. So how's that purpose driven our response this year to those two trends that I mentioned? Firstly, in terms of economic transition, Lewis Keeble was an advocate of the view that planning is, and I quote him, the art and science of ordering the use of land so as to secure the maximum practicable degree of economy, convenience and beauty. So in other words, he emphasised the link between land use and economic opportunity. And we're working very, very hard within the department to bring together again, and I do say again because we've lost it a little here in Queensland, to bring together again those disciplines of economic planning, land use planning and infrastructure planning. They travel together, they should travel together. They give us the opportunity to take a place-based view of Queensland's regions to ensure that the work of all the other agencies and all the levels of government makes sense and cohere in that place in a way that helps them meet their social and economic aspirations. So we're working very hard to stitch those disciplines back together again. In terms of the second trend, population growth, our planners have never been busier. They have been busy. They've never been busier. In just the last 12 months, let me just rattle through some of what they've been up to, because it's important to acknowledge their work. They've updated the South East Queensland Regional Plan, and anyone who's been associated with those exercises knows that that's a heck of a job in just 12 months. It normally takes 2 years and has taken as much as 3 or 3.5 years. They've progressed the Wide Bay Burnett Plan and the Far North Queensland Plan. They've written and introduced the Housing Availability and Affordability Bill, which includes a new state-facilitated application process for social and affordable housing in infill areas. They've prepared the draft Redlands Housing Strategy. They've released the Caboolture West Interim Structure Plan to fast-track about 13,000 new homes over the next 15 years. They've reformed a bunch of regulations, including the Queensland Rural Workers Accommodation Initiative, allowing secondary dwellings like granny flats to be rented in the open market. They've created a streamlined approval pathway for social and affordable dwellings through ministerial infrastructure designations. As well, they completed the short-term rental accommodation review. They made a number of temporary local planning instruments to help local governments respond to emergent issues like development at Kurilpa, resource recovery, waste issues and flooding, and they reviewed State Code 23 on wind farm development. And that's all on top of their core work of assessing applications through SARA and the work that they do in helping local governments change their planning schemes. It's a team I'm immensely proud of, not just for the amount of work that they've done over the last 12 months, but also for the significance of that work. I'm really very proud of the way that we've responded to this crisis with an attitude of, in a sense, not wasting it, to do some of the reform that in other times might be a little challenging. So I'm proud of them, particularly for the courage they've shown this year in facing up to some really tough calls. They're led by the incredibly passionate and fearless state planner Tess Pickering, and Tess is someone I learn from every single day. So who knows, maybe by next year, my third Keeble Lecture, I might even be an expert. Enjoy the lecture.
Thanks very much, Mike. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce the Keeble Lecturer for 2023, Greg Chemello. I'm just going to pull out a few snippets from his bio. And so, you know, Greg's known to many of you in the room. He has over 40 years of experience in land use and infrastructure planning, property development, development project delivery, economic development, stakeholder and community engagement, and corporate governance. So he's the full kit and caboodle there. Over the last 20 years, his leadership has focused on public and private sector asset owners and private sector development, advisory and consulting businesses. And he's worked with organisations that have and led them through significant transformation. What I'm struck by from Greg's, he's a lifelong learner. He holds a Bachelor of Regional Town Planning and Honours, a Master of Science, and a Master of Business Administration. And I also know he's a lapsed piano player as well. Greg has had a career, has traversed land use planning, trade and investment facilitation, public venue development, state planning, economic development. And the list of titles he's held across local and state government is significant. And of course, many of you would be aware of his roles in terms of leading Ipswich City Council as their interim administrator, and then before he moved off to Moreton Bay Regional Council to be their CEO. So since finishing up that sort of full-time executive employment in early 2023, Greg is now doing the board circuit. So he's a board member on with a number of companies and statutory agencies providing strategic strategic advice services on projects to public and private sector clients. So sounds like a very busy workbook. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Greg.
Thank you very much, Steph, much appreciated. Being the 31st of the month, I know that at least half of you are here not because of me, but you just want to avoid those pesky kids at your house trick-or-treating. So I'm not fooled by that. I guess at the end of this, you'll have to decide whether tonight from me is a trick or a treat, and I'll leave that to you. I am actually old enough to be lectured by Lewis Keeble. Which, as Steph said, 1979 I started uni at UQ, and that was Lewis's last year. Jeff, you were there. Steve, you lectured by Lewis, so don't tell him, he was incredibly boring. But it was his last year, I'm sure, so he used to lean against the desk, open up the book and read the chapters of his book. And I used to think, that's not really lecturing as far as I could see, and I also thought, you wrote the book, why are you reading it? You should know it. But anyway, principles and practice of town planning. But I'm really glad that experience, because I feel that those of us who are part of that, were part of that, the end of the era of planning, so the beginning of the end of the era, and that was the beginning of the end of the era of that rigid prescriptive planning that he was advancing, and to what we now refer to as performance-based planning. So I'll talk a little bit more about performance-based planning and my views about that, and I'll apologise in advance to some in the room. I'm not going to take you on a tour of my career, because that would be certainly a trick and not a treat. But I thought today I'd raise 4 what I believe are truths that it took me too long to learn. I wish I'd learned earlier. Give you some examples of these, and hopefully inspire some of the younger ones, and maybe some of the not so younger ones, to think of these moments of truth, I guess, in your future milestone moments of your working life. Also, as my right as a grumpy old man, because we're now 40, but people used to get up and say so-and-so had 30 or 40 years experience, so I thought, what an old bugger. And that's me. So my right as a grumpy old man, I'm also going to have a whinge about 3 issues relating to planning and development. My views about performance-based planning, planners and communication, and the relationship that planners and political leaders have with the development industry. The first question, I guess, is why did I do town planning? And for years I've answered that question with an explanation which is true. My father was a house painter, and I used to love going with Dad looking at houses, and Dad would explain why that particular building worked or didn't work, and if they moved that wall. So he was a frustrated non-architect. And so I grew up with that, and I loved architecture, still love it. I was going to be an architect, and then I figured, why be an architect and just design a house, and I can design a city. And that was the 17-year-old's logic of why I did town planning. But when I was writing the notes for this, I realised there's actually a greater truth than that for me, and that was because I had always had this strong desire to bring, and those of you who know me well will laugh at this, order to chaos. So I always wanted to see order in the built environment, and I thought that's what planners did. We fixed all the stuff up and the streets were nice and everything was neat. So it was that kind of strong view to do that, and that driver led me into do town planning. I probably failed at that, to be honest, because I didn't do planning for all that long. But I guess I've had more of a focus, as Steph has touched on, in organisations, and trying to bring some semblance of order and strategy to the way that organisations work and tick in the public and private sector over the last 30 years. So it's the same driver. And I'm very grateful for that initial planning degree that I did, because people talk about it, but it did talk me about those fundamental frameworks and principles on how you organise and plan things. And it has been translatable for me into organisation leadership. So looking back on the last 40 years, there's 4 lessons I wish I'd have learnt much earlier. Number 1, and I'll come into some details, others, the mentors that people talk about, others see you differently and you trust them. Number 2, in the milestone, challenging moments of your career, back yourself. Number 3, a simple, shared, understood mission or vision is pure gold. And number 4, in the end, it's all about the people. And I'll talk about those 4. So my first learning is trust others who see you differently and that perhaps suggest pathways that you don't see yourself. And I've been really, really fortunate in my life to have a number of mentors. They weren't called mentors in my day, but people who fundamentally shaped my working life for the better, and I'm going to steal this opportunity to publicly thank them, even though some of them aren't around anymore. A chappie called Adrian Black from a company called Fricka Developments, he took a punt on me to leave the state government to join the property sector back in 1989. The late Sir Lou Edwards, the first board chairman I ever reported to, encouraged me to persist in the property sector, even after Fricka financially collapsed. A chap called Rick Paris, who was state manager of Lend Lease, pressed me towards looking at the Gabba redevelopment, which I did get, and ML Design, running a design firm, running a firm of architects like herding cats. It's interesting. Mark Stockwell is actually younger than me, but Mark Stockwell, you know him as Olympic swimmer, ex-Olympic swimmer and property developer, who took a punt on me to lead his design and construction business. And then ironically, Sir Lou Edwards' son, David Edwards, again younger than me, who backed me into the planning group and the EDQ board back in 2012. But I did have the chance last week in Gladstone at the LGQ conference to thank Sterling Hinchcliffe, who was then the Minister for Local Government, who nominated me to the state to be the Ipswich Administrator. And it was great to have the chance to acknowledge him with him in the REM last week. So these folks and others always saw something in me that sometimes I wasn't quite prepared to believe. But I've said to others in many years, my attitude has always been to bite off more than you can chew and chew like hell. So I took up the challenges that they enabled me to do. I'll give you only one example. I joined Fricker Developments in '89, walked into Adrian's office and said that the World Trade Centres Association, they meet every 6 months. The application was closing next week for a new trade centre licence, so I was focusing on the next 6 months meeting to do the application. He looked at me and said, "You can do it, you've got a week." So I was really flabbergasted, went back, said it's impossible. A week later I gave him a business plan for a World Trade Centre in Auckland, which we were chasing, like 5-year budgets. I did cash flows, balance sheets. I did that on Lotus 123, if anybody of any age remembers Lotus 123. Business unit operational plans, a development strategy, a Gantt chart, letters from 3 leading developers around Auckland saying that we were negotiating with them on their site for the World Trade Centre. And letters of support from the City Mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, the New Zealand Government. This is 1989, there was no internet then, this was faxes and phones. Walked in, gave him the report, he was flabbergasted then. I'd taken up the challenge because I thought he believed that I could do that. He actually didn't believe I could do that, as I found out later on. I kept that report for years because it was proof that you can do things that you think are impossible if someone backs you, even though he didn't. But these, I guess the message is, these are my mentors and my sponsors. Everybody has their own mentors. Sometimes they see things that we don't see about ourselves, and my message is based on my experience is trust them, and trust their view of you, and follow that. My second point is, in those critical turning point moments in your career, back yourself. And this is different from when others prompt or support you. This is backing yourself when you have a very strong conviction about something. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. In the year 2000, I finished managing the Gabba redevelopment and joined the Brisbane City Council as the manager of major venues. And I did that to extract out of them the Sleeman Centre, Burnell Entertainment Centre, and the QE2 Sports Complex that were then owned by Brisbane City Council. And there was this idea of this super trust, one organisation that would run them all. The sticking point was the price that would be agreed between the state and the council for those venues. So council's asset team wanted 260 million, is my memory. Now my memory is pretty dodgy, but 260 million was the replacement value of building those 3 venues, and that's what they wanted the state to pay. The venues were costing the ratepayers of Brisbane $5 million a year in operating losses. So what would you pay if I gave you something or sold you something and it's going to lose you $5 million a year? So the arguments were running on, and it'd been going on for ages. So I stuck my neck out. I went in and presented to Civic Cabinet. Those of that work for Brisbane City Council presented to Civic Cabinet. It's a terrifying experience. And my first slide recommended that we sell the venues to the state for $1. So you can imagine the reaction of the room. I just wrote here, much angst was expressed by councillors. But I looked at the end of the table and Lord Mayor Jim Sawley just nodded, and I thought, I think I got you. He rang me a few days later and said he'd had a coffee with the then Sports Minister and Treasurer McEnroth. They shook hands on the deal, and it was up to me just to negotiate the details. And that's how Stadiums Queensland was started. But it took me to stick my neck out at a bunch of political leaders with staff from either side of me not liking what I was saying to do that. Look, a more recent example is the Planning Act 2016. I returned to the state government 2013 specifically to lead the reform of what I consider to be a convoluted planning system for the then Newman government. For me, it was once in a lifetime opportunity, only chance I ever had to do that sort of role. But the problem was Assistant Minister Ian Walker wasn't convinced we should do a roots and all reform, nor was Deputy Premier Jeff Seeney, nor in fact was the planning and development industry The annual forum, if those of you who remember that from 2013, there were 3 out of 4 speakers who said we do not need a new Planning Act, we just need to tinker a little bit. So I was a bit stymied because I'd just taken on this job of my life and that's what I was presented with. Ian was then promoted to be the Arts Minister. In walked Rob Mollock, who was the new Assistant Planning Minister, and Rob sort of walked in and said, "What have we done? What are we doing?" And I said, "We're doing a new Planning Act." And he said, "Cool." And off we walked, and that's how we started doing the Planning Act, which ended up becoming 2016. So, you know, I look back, and that was a bit naughty, but it worked in the end. And I'll speak about the Planning Act and some views about its current structure soon. But my advice is out of that, you know, when you truly believe in something, my experience is stick your neck out and chase it, because the rewards can be quite significant. My third learning is the importance of this simple shared vision or mission. And this is more than just the textbook. Those of you who do an MBA learn about this in business. It's actually critical when dealing with change. Organisational change, yes, but also community change when they're dealing with development. And the vision must be short. That's critical. I learnt this through some very different experiences. A couple of examples. I actually stumbled into being appointed the General Manager of the Queensland Dairy Authority in my great knowledge of the dairy industry back in the mid-90s when the government had legislated to deregulate the industry. So I adopted the phrase, "We're going to die with dignity." And that was our catch cry. So we progressively deregulated and people were progressively retrenched or terminated over the 18 months in a very structured way and respectful way. It was a tough way to do it, but we said we're going to die with dignity, and the authority did close down. But we retained all the staff until when we needed them to go. I was with a business called Rambry, Project Managers, Development Management Consulting business, and we adopted the turning point. That was our catch cry. Every capital project reaches a point where you're either going to go down or you're going to go well, and there's a critical decision there. And our pitch was that we were the team, we had the expertise to make that turning point successful. It was a very simple expression and a very effective message to convey to our staff and our clients. The planning reform agenda under the Newman government, I then coined the phrase "making it real" as our catch try, and we then used that template against which we measured every single component of the land use planning and development assessment system. My personal aim was to reform our planning framework so that every aspect was what I call real. In other words, it had a real, genuine impact on development outcomes and not fluff. All the other nice wording that makes other people feel good, but actually makes no material difference to the outcomes. So the 220-page Planning and Development Bill 2014 was a baby. We did that in 18 months of discussion with industry. I'm still very proud of. And sadly, this is my personal perspective, at least, that was discarded. There was a change of government that resulted in a much larger Planning Act we're now dealing with is in force. And sorry, in my view, it retains a lot of the planning fluff. We didn't get to make it real, which still hurts. It's not meant to be a party political comment. I certainly understand, completely agree with democratic processes of government and the obligation, I strongly believe in the obligation of the public sector to deliver on the government of the day's agenda. It just wasn't my personal agenda to continue with ecological sustainability as a pretend target. I've yet to see a truly ecological sustainable development. The precautionary principle, I hate it. It's a terrible conservative constraint, in my view, on human growth. Overly cumbersome planning scheme amendment processes still. Regional plans, with respect, that still have a lot of ineffective fluff. Development applications. Development applicants have to go through this endless process of transport modelling and flood modelling, even though it makes no damn difference to the outcome at the end of the day. The continued misuse, in my view, of ministerial designations to shift impact costs from the state to local government. Complex 3 tiers of government environmental offsets arrangements. I could go on, but I've already offended half of you in the room. But it's not, a lot of it isn't real, in my view. I've gone off on a tangent. It's my little, that's a fourth whinge, I should have said that. Probably offended a few of you. The point of come back to the point I was trying to make, that I really galvanise people into action. The short, sharp and meaningful vision or purpose statement is pure gold. Need to forget about those lengthy planning mission statements we all have to prepare. We'd have to do them, that's cool. But they don't galvanise people into action as much as a simple slogan or a mantra that can be truly believed by the people. My fourth and final learning for folks is it's all about the people. When I started in the planning career, I felt I didn't know about 2 particular aspects of planning, how planning was influenced by or influenced the environment, and how planning was influenced by business. So I toddled off and did a Masters of Environmental Science and an MBA. to learn those two gaps. I was actually wrong. The fundamental shortfall in my knowledge was social psychology, the study of personalities, of interpersonal relationships, group behaviour and communication. Because nothing happens unless individuals understand and agree and commit to some action. I do believe all the complexities, the environmental impacts and environmental feasibilities and all the issues we're facing are solvable when people get in and commit to action. And this relates to developers committing. Otherwise, if we don't have developers committing, all we have is a bunch of colourful maps and lengthy documents with lovely words, but no actual outcome on the ground. It relates to enabling our political leaders and our opinion leaders in the community to understand and make decisions. And it relates to communities' understanding, and either they fight against or accept the change that we're presenting in that critical role for community engagement. Successful town planning is all about people. It's not necessarily studying extra about the environment or finance. It's about people, helping leaders, our leaders, to make the right decisions and helping people understand and adjust to change. So my suggestion is take up the challenge of learning more about this field of social psychology. Replace that seminar you were going to on ESD or housing and go join a workshop on group behaviour, personality assessment, the art of negotiation. I did some wonderful courses on negotiation which changed my approach to discussion. It will really pay off. So now I'm going to have my 3 grumpy old man whinges, even though I've already had one. Firstly, this is a technical expression. I think we've stuffed up performance-based planning in Queensland. How can we expect the public to trust us? We take them through this significant community engagement in a planning scheme or a local area plan, and then we approve a 15-storey building where the scheme says an acceptable solution is 8 storeys. Public don't understand that. Over the years, in various roles, I've read some beautifully crafted reports with lengthy discussions justifying outcomes in terms of the height, the density, the setbacks. And much of what I've read is creative, jargonistic, and highly subjective, in my view, rubbish. And we fall for it. We fall for it and we approve developments that ought to be either refused or materially amended. And the public don't get that. Public planning should be principle-driven and outcomes-focused, not process-motivated. So a lengthy process of seeking creative reports, peer-reviewing them by other creative folks, does not replace a very reasoned assessment upfront of the principles that we had committed to our communities in our planning instruments. I recall an EDQ having a huge argument with one of our leading architects, so I'm really pleased he's not here today. He wanted to explain how his proposed 1.5 metre tower setback from the next residential tower had complied with all the performance outcomes of the North Shore Hamilton PDA development scheme, which actually said 9 metres was the setback. I just rudely, I was rude, and I don't think I did apologise actually afterwards, but I refused to debate it. Principles matter. You don't lose them through Weasley reports. And I hope you appreciate where I'm coming from. At the start of the chat, I talked about Professor Keeble's book, Principles and Practices of Town and Country Planning. It was, in my view, the epitome of the 1950s and 1960s approach to planning in the UK and Australia. Very prescriptive, formulaic, highly structured. And I really struggled with that school of thought, and I still do. But it's not about it. I'm not talking about rigidity now, sticking to a planning instrument. But let's not mistake flexibility for pulling the wool and getting the wool pulled over our eyes. Our communities are tired of it, and I know this through the jobs, particularly in the last 10 years of dealing with the communities. We should be far better at true performance-based planning, and I think we can do better. My second whinge is about communication, specifically that on the whole, the planning profession has a very long way to go to be in a position where it communicates effectively with our communities. It was bad when I started out 40 years ago. I don't think it's much better now. I have read some, I wrote down here, shocking, it's true, shocking planning reports over the years. Full of jargon, masses of irrelevant detail, no rational pathway from the issues assessment to the recommendations, and we need to do a lot better. The expression less is more is often spot on. The profession does need to communicate with communities and our political leaders with clarity and with respect. And bombarding both those, community leaders and politicians, with technical jargon is certainly not the way to go. It's not a criticism of recent Moreton Bay reports, for those of you in the room from Moreton Bay, but I have seen a lot of bad reports over the years. My third and final whinge is that the vilification of the development industry is wrong, especially in a housing crisis. I understand the risk of corruption You know, as was pointed out, I was administrator for Ipswich City Council. There's another, I'm still involved in that field, there's another role we'll talk about later on, not tonight, in the future, in that area. But fundamentally, when you've got a really gnarly problem, just say pick an example out of the air, significant housing shortfall, the most sensible approach is to engage meaningfully with the folks that can actually solve the problem. But here in Queensland, we do have state and local elected representatives avoiding and or scared, and actually I've met a whole bunch of councillors who are terrified of being seen with a developer in fear of being accused of corrupt conduct or misconduct. And there has to be a better way than this. Put simply, as I said earlier, without the development industry, all we have is pretty maps and documents. They're the folks that make it happen. When I was at Ipswich as administrator, talking with community groups who complained about those greedy developers, because I didn't report to anybody as administrator, it was a pretty cool job. I was emboldened, I'd say to them, yes, those bloody developers. You know, the problem with them is they build the houses that we live in, the streets in which we drive, the shops, the offices, the factories we work. They build the water and sewer pipes, and then they expect to get paid for it. And even some of them expect to make a profit. They should do it for free. And most people would look at me, you know, what's he talking about? And I'm sure I annoyed some people at the time, possibly some people tonight. But I hope you see my point. We need the industry. They are our delivery partners. We need to stop the vilification of the industry and deal with them with greater respect and open ears and open minds. Last month, Committee for Brisbane Fund Luncheon, I met a person that I had occasional professional contact with over the years, and he said to me, your reputation lingers wherever you go, wherever he went. Your impact is like a series of ripples in the water. And I was actually quite chuffed with that comment because looking back, one of the greatest sense of achievements I have is when I played some role, maybe small, in helping others adapt to change, make positive career changes, think differently about the challenges they face, or achieve things that initially they thought were not possible. So today I hope I've created a few more ripples, hopefully positive ripples. Thanks for your time. Whether it's a trick or a treat, that's up to you. Ta.
Wow, thank you very much, Greg. So everyone's awake now, aren't they? So that was a really terrific provocation too. Again, for the established planners, there's also our young planners in the room. And for people who are coming from a range of different backgrounds, because I know we do have architects in the room as well. So the team, Ben and others and Sophie have mics. Greg has kindly agreed to answer some questions. And so I do ask, I will be a bit strict. We're taking questions, prefer not statements. So is that okay? We'll try and do questions first. I'm sure Greg can hang around. We might even finish on time or a bit early so you can catch up and have a conversation later. So first question. Yes? Do you want to pass you on?
Howard Briggs, I had a chance to talk to Greg beforehand, and it's clear we've come through a similar path in many respects. I feel very strongly about the community consultation bit, but I'm really disappointed that the PIA doesn't seem to try to engage professionally with the community through these forums. I put forward a proposal some while ago about inviting an informed person in the community to come along to some of the professional development activities for both parties to learn. I think there's a lot of ignorance on both sides. Have you got any views on that, Greg?
The communication gap is huge. I kind of knew that in previous roles, and it really became to the fore to me when I went to Ipswich. And putting aside these Ipswich-specific factors, and then the job in Moreton Bay as well, people don't get planning, and that's kind of okay, right, in one respect. But I think that comes back to my point about the reality of planning. So that example I gave of the 15-story and 8-story is a real example. I didn't make that up. And when people see that kind of behaviour, that's when they lose it. So we've got to behave, we can talk and we need to communicate a lot better with the community, but we've also got to behave differently. So we can't just we can't open a dialogue with the community and still make those, what I call zany decisions. We've got to get our performance-based planning better and at the same time we can engage with the community, because then they'll listen. At the moment, my fear is, based on the discussions I've had with people over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, is that they don't want to talk until they see the behaviour different. And that's tough. It requires a change.
Thanks. Thanks, Greg. Another question? Yep. Down the front, we'll grab Ben's coming over the mic.
Greg, thanks for a great presentation, very insightful. My impression with my comment about the planning profession is, in some ways, that we've retreated, lost courage to go out there and communicate. And there's, I think a lot of planners are retreated because of the ICAC, the political environment, the social media environment, and there's a lot of blame game around the profession at the moment. And we've kind of lost that capability of conflict resolution as well, which I think is a key educational tool for planners. Do you have any comment about how we kind of regain that courage, if you like, and get out there and improve that communication as a profession?
It requires some bravery in one respect, and I'll answer it by giving an example. When I was at EDQ, we went out to a community consultation we organised at Oxley, the old Oxley High School site, where I finished high school. So I was bulldozing and developing my school. Not blatantly, but... And one of the planners, a very experienced planner in the car, said, "You're really relaxed about this, Greg. You know, you've done this before." And I said, "Hell, I haven't done this, and I was at university." Which I shouldn't have said. So she was petrified. And we got smashed by the community in this community meeting. We went back again and again and again. But because the planners were there, and my wife's a communications expert, so we close your ears for a sec. We didn't have the comms people, we had the planners. That worked because we were the people that were making the decisions, writing the reports, to our elected reps. So I think part of that is the bravery that we need to empower our staff to do, in terms of planners, to get out and talk to the community about the specific issues that affect them. But it's a challenge, you know. You have to have a thick skin, because you do get verbally bashed up. I kind of like that. Like, I love the challenge of convincing people that their thinking might not be the way I think, and maybe there's another way. But a lot of folks don't think that way. We should teach that as part of the university course, and I'm always conscious of people who say we should teach more things because we've got to take things out to create the space. But you know, I certainly, when I went through, and I gather, I don't know how much you talk these days about in uni about communication and the social psychology stuff, but we did one semester, I think, Steve, on social psychology or psychology, which I thought was the most useless semester at the time, but it was probably the most valuable one in retrospect. Yeah.
More questions? Oh, great.
Greg, thanks so much for that, Adam Beck. I wanted to get your views, pick up on that point around developers in the private sector. I find myself working for an employer that's owned by Australian Super. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking lots and lots and lots and lots of money that's looking for long-term returns, nothing short. And as a sort of a city shaper within the organisation, I'm trying to wrestle with how are we, the collective we, public sector, private sector, going to engage private sector capital in city shaping, sort of longer term. Could you share any views or thoughts, what you've learned along the way about how government, not just sort of, you know, the catch cry of, oh, we want to attract private sector capital. You know, we roll up all the time wanting to invest, but the frameworks aren't there and there's not a lot of experience. What would your comments be around that quirky challenge?
We do need to treat those, because the development sector is so diverse, you know. There are everything from what you're talking about, really long-term strategic funds who do want to do great things. They've got a brand, they want to retain the image of their brand, so they're not fly-by-night developers, all the way through to, you know, dodgy brothers. And the industry's like that. We can't treat them all the same. So those folks that I've dealt with, a few of those, they are brilliant partners. They have got patience, they have got strategy, and they are concerned about their long-term reputation, and they want to leave a legacy. Move your way down the spectrum, we'll come back to that in a sec, you know, a whole bunch of the development industry, in my view, and I worked for them as a consultant and worked for some developers, still have the long-term interests. And most of the people that I deal with in the industry do not want to drive past something in 20 years and be embarrassed by it. You know, that they seriously have long-term vision. and we get impacted by that bit. So we've got to deal with what I call dodgy brothers in a different way. We have dealt, in EDQ in particular and Moreton Bay, are the two examples I can think of in my career where we've dealt with those long-term investors in a different way, taken them on as a partner. At the mill, I can't give you the details of the site, but the Petrie Mill site at Moreton Bay, there's a couple of very, very long-term interested parties who were our partners. They're not a contract they were going to do it to sell a site to. They're a long-term development partner. We tried that at Ipswich, before I went to Ipswich actually. When I was at Branbury, we tried to get a long-term partner for the Ipswich CBD, that didn't work out. But again, that was treating them in a different way. So there is an enormous amount of goodwill and long-term ambition by a lot of those funds. They're not what we would classically talk about. When I went to uni, we made a stupid movie called The Planning Movie, on Super 8 film it was too. That was the developer versus, we wore silly hats and wigs and moustaches, and it's embarrassing. If everyone sees it, burn it, please. But that's what I thought when I was a kid, you know, they were the nasty people. And it was only being out and I realised nothing happens unless they do stuff and spend their money and their effort and their reputation on the line. Nothing happens. So we need to help them do that, and it's treating them with respect. It's talking to them. I know the real answer. The real answer is we just need to talk more, and the answers will come out.
Right, we'll go over to this side of the room for the next question.
Hi Greg, if you were given $3 billion to spend in fixing the Queensland planning system, what would you prioritise?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I have a very strong personal conviction about making it simple, not simple, making it real, still. And what I did find going in there was, and to a lot lesser extent now, so we did part of it, was we talk about the same issue in 16 different documents. So we confuse everybody with that. You know, in my simplistic world, bringing order to chaos, I'd say if there's an issue, let's talk about housing diversity. It's part of the state planning policy. Housing diversity, you must comply with that. Or here's what we absolutely must comply with, here's what we'd like you to comply with, and here's what we definitely don't want you to do. Simple. And nowhere else. So anyone wants to talk about housing, that's where you go. So, you know, all those issues are replicated or summarised or reinterpreted in other documents. It was like that before the Planning Act 2016. We gutted a lot of that out. 14 state planning policies, now down to 1, that sort of stuff. So I'm proud of what we did there. But I would gut it and make it simple. Now, the risk of making it simple is things slip through. And normally that would be a bigger risk than I think now. Now is the time with the housing situation we're in where we have to take risks. And we have to take calculated risks. So I would be saying this is a perfect time. I gave a presentation to the UDIA about a year into COVID, talked to about 100 odd people at Moreton Bay, and I said, well, this is not a war, but it kind of is. At the time we need to throw the rule book out and do something different. And I'm the guy who helped write the rule book. But I look back and I think it doesn't suit where we are now. You know, this is a real, we're still dealing as if we're a great first world economy and everybody's ticking along hunky-dory. We're not. So when we have the homelessness problems we have, which I still struggle with personally, peel everything out, make it basic. Some stuff will get through we don't really like. That's probably okay, because we're going to fix the problem we're in.
Okay, question from down the front.
Yeah,
you did.
Jeff Humphreys, can I please be excused by making a comment first about Lewis Keeble? Because Greg, you saw him in 1979 when he was right at the end of his career, and I started some years earlier, and he was actually quite an inspirational figure. And I was talking to a friend of mine, a contemporary, only in the last couple of weeks, and he's still in practice, believe it or not, a bit older than me too. And he said, sometimes when I'm starting out to address a planning problem, I think, what would Lewis do? So, and he said that with sincerity. So he was an inspirational figure. The question I wanted to ask you though, Greg, it doesn't actually come out of your talk, but you had some terrific experience in state government at a very senior level, and you also worked in very senior positions in South East Queensland in large local governments such as we have in South East Queensland. And, you know, we've got the 4 largest local governments in Australia in South East Queensland, and Logan's not far behind. I just wondered what your observations might be about how well we are served in planning in South East Queensland at a detail level and up to the regional level by the particular governmental arrangements we have with these big local governments.
Okay, so I was a huge fan. I am a huge fan of the amalgamated councils. I think when that was done in 2008, I was in the private sector, so I missed all the pain and angst that people went through with that. But I think it's the right thing to do. I was always a big fan of the amalgamated City of Brisbane since 1934, from memory. Not so much anymore. I think the danger of big councils is you lose contact with the community. Interestingly, when you do staff per ratepayer or staff per ratepayer or per budget analysis, Brisbane City Council is the most inefficient council in South East Queensland. It ought not to be. It ought to be the most efficient council. Its ratio should be much lower through economies of scale. The logic being it's a big council, but it's not. So that rang alarm bells to me. I didn't realise that until I moved to Moreton Bay. So I don't think that particularly works well. I think the planning profession across all the councils, we have some amazingly talented planners across those councils. Number one, I should have said that up front. And notwithstanding my earlier comments about communication, a lot of them communicate really badly, but their thinking and analysis is brilliant, and I have been amazed by that. I think we could govern ourselves a little bit better. The smaller councils, and you deal with them. I've been going to Local Government Association of Queensland conferences for 13 years now, as a consultant and as a state and as a local person, and now I'm on the board of Peak Services, the company that the LGAQ owns. So I drink a lot of red wine with mayors, which is a great part of the job. And the smaller councils get it. They are closer to the people. So I think there is a tipping point. I think Brisbane is over the tipping point, and it's very difficult for an organisation like Brisbane City Council to get back in contact with the people. Moreton Bay is in danger of that as well. Gold Coast is certainly in danger of that as well. So I don't know is the honest answer, because I like the amalgamated. I get the efficiencies of that brings, but there's a tipping point where it becomes you lose touch with the purpose that you're there, which is not to serve the current interests of the current residents, but to serve the long-term interests of the current and future residents. I just memorised that from the Act because that was my job as the administrator. So that was a neat way of thinking about administration, was what's the best long-term thing to do? And a lot of local councillors get caught away from that. If we brought them back to that test, life becomes a lot easier. The job at Ipswich was easy, I say, for me, because there was one test. What's the best long-term thing for the long-term residents of this community? And we need to somehow enshrine that back in the system. And I'd give that a solid bash before I went into a reorganisation of councils.
I think there's another question over here.
Hey,
Hey Greg,
Hey,
Julie Brooke.
Good.
I just wanted to reflect for a second on your comment before about, or your whinge about performance-based planning. That's all good, mate. I'm kind of on board with that. Love the simplicity. I worry though in my involvement with PIA and our engagement with universities and erosion a little bit of available courses, our current capacity problems in the industry. You just can't find planners. That balance between simplicity and true performance-based planning versus the skills and capacity that we have in the industry to be able to really deliver that performance-based planning. And that harkens back to something that another one of our Life Fellows said a long time ago, Chris Schomburg. I remember he said, you know, if you're a planner worth your salt, then you don't have to read the planning report, you just look at the plans and you know whether it's a good idea or not. And, you know, as a lapsed DA planner, I can probably count the number of DA reports I never read because you just look at the plans and you know whether it fits or not. So I was just wondering your view on that balance between true performance-based planning and then the skills that we currently have in the industry.
Yeah, it's a tough issue for our sector, but also across the board, isn't it? So in any discipline, engineering, surveying, any of the built environment, you go to the coffee shops, people, there's a shortage of people, and there's a shortage of qualified people no matter where you go. You wonder what's happened in the world, because we're in the UK and there's signs everywhere about staff needed, so what's happened? Planning's no different. When I went to uni, which is a long time ago, obviously, we weren't blatantly taught, we were kind of taught that we were the expert. The community ought to let us do what we know, and we're really good because we're qualified planners. It wasn't as bad as that, but that's kind of the view that I came out. And it was a bit of, let's form a view up front, and let's form a view up front of that applicant. So I was a little bit uncomfortable with that as a 20-year-old. I'm a lot more comfortable with that now as a 60-year-old. So with experience does come, I think, the ability to go, fundamentally that's a good project. You know, let's have a bit of a manoeuvre around it, but apart from that, or fundamentally it's a bad project, go away. We will struggle because, like all those other built environment disciplines, there is a shortage, and that ability to navigate our way through complicated documents and complicated reports is a challenge. The biggest difference now is to 40 years ago is social media, not social media, that whole people can see. You know, you could fool them all 40 years ago because they didn't know. They just see the building pop up. I'm not saying it was a good thing, but it was a different world. So the ability for people to form a view, research it quickly and become instant experts of what we do is astronomical. And I think that's possibly the biggest constraint that I didn't talk about and should have, to what we do. Because it's pretty difficult when you're forming a view and you're talking about it to the community and the councillor knows about it, you know, 3 seconds later because I've just hammered him or her. So there's no easy answer to that expertise, but there is a balance we need to have, and I think the pendulum's swung too far, where in my mind I've seen, you know, too many folks go through the process of getting all the independent reports and writing the report recommendation and cutting and pasting, and not sitting down and going, actually, that development is a poor outcome or it's a great outcome, and we need to say yes, and we need to adjust some things. That bit is the bit that's probably missing.
Okay. Question from the front.
Hi Greg, my question to you is how would you combat the vilification of developers? So I think for like property developers specifically and housing developers, that a lot of the vilification comes from fear of neighbourhood change and NIMBYism, but also a lack of affordable housing that's provided by the private sector. So I guess, yeah, how would you, or what strategies do you think that we could use to combat the vilification of property developers?
Yeah, no, really good question. It's talking. Like, I know that's a weak answer back, but it's actually engaging and talking with them. So the Property Council and the UDIA are both really good organisations. You know, I've dealt with them for years, and they, and not all, but a fair bulk of their membership are quite willing to sit down and have a natter and open and transparent. Yes, they've got different drivers sometimes to what we might have. I'll say we as a planner, even though I'm not really elapsed. But I think we can deal with that honestly. You know, you deal with that all the time in life, where people have different drivers to what you have, and you get on and you engage, and you set the parameters and you have a chat about it. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know that talking, and the more we talk with them, and when we respectfully engage with them and talk about the housing issues we're facing, why don't things stack up? I know Morton's doing a bit of work, done a bit of work in terms of that. Thanks, Peter, for your work on that too, looking at an infill task force, how to do that. So we just need to do that rather, and sadly the legislation needs to get changed, because at the moment, you know, councillors are validly, often not validly concerned about being accused of misconduct. So it's not a matter of gifts and all that sort of stuff, it's actually open, transparent, chatting.
Great. Oh, yep, Liam.
Liam Henry here, private town planner. I'm from Ipswich, but private, which is enjoyable, and I certainly appreciate your time that you spent in Ipswich. I saw a difference in the community. I was born and raised there, and speaking with business owners and developers and the like, we did notice a difference. It was great when you were there.
Yeah, thank you.
Shame when you left. My question, I like your comments about taking risks, also the challenges around understanding how to address performance-based planning in a better way. What my biggest gripe is, I suppose, town planning schemes that quite old, in Ipswich being 2006. The challenge with that is taking risks is a bit trickier. Performance-based planning is a bit trickier. It's a 17-year-old planning scheme, and there's other regional planning schemes also that are quite old as well. What do you think could be made better to allow councils to fast-track their evolution of their schemes so that they don't take so long to implement? Because at the moment, schemes are just taking way too long to go through the process. I know public consultation is important, but they're taking a long time to implement it. It's making it difficult, I would say, for owners, developers to make decisions when they're in this limbo period, I suppose. That's what I want to know. How do you make these things more efficient for planning schemes to be implemented?
Yeah, because I think when I left Ipswich was early 2020, the draft scheme was supposed to be out for consultation then. That's 3.5 years ago. Has been out, hasn't it? And just gone back in. It's one of my bugbears I talked about was the process is too long. This is a balancing act that is a real struggle for state and local government between the autonomies of councils to get on and do stuff for their local community, as I talked about being close to the community, versus the state saying, that's the template, use the template, and don't use anything else. And we need a bit more of that, I think. And I think it would help enormously if the state has often been concerned about over-regulating local governments and let them do what they do. But when you're doing this review of planning schemes, and when I was DDG planning, like 3 years, and we reviewed schemes through that process, in the end, no matter what councils wanted to do, it came back to the views of my staff about what ought to be in the planning scheme or not. So we should have just probably published that and said, that's what we need, you know. Now that's not perfect, that's very imperfect. But we need to have that better balance between, yes, councils can do some flexibility, but there needs to be some standard templates, and we're telling you that's the way it is. It is annoying to the industry when you go from council to council and you are dealing with fundamentally different schemes and fundamentally different requirements. That's really a real challenge that doesn't need to be there, because we're not that different. And one of the big failures for me in that process was I didn't engage with Indigenous communities enough to have a template Indigenous planning scheme. And when I left that job, I realised we let that drop. Similar thing in South East Queensland. The differences between the big council's planning scheme is just too great. And we've let people get carried away with their own view of what the scheme ought to do. So it's kind of much more controlling than that, and saying the framework needs to be this. That's what. And the risk needs to be that not all state interests need to be signed and ticked off to the nth degree. That's always been a bugbear for a lot of people. And it's been a bugbear for me for a long time. It's taking some risks and knowing that some stuff will slip through. But you've got to question the stuff that we've got around. Some of this development we've approved in the last 20 years is some pretty bad stuff. So even with what we've got at the moment, stuff's slipping through. So maybe we need a different way of just having a template and limited flexibility and zip it through and take a risk. Yeah.
Okay, we're coming right up to the end, but I do have one question for you. Because we want to leave on an optimistic note.
Yep.
So on a scale of 1 to 5, how optimistic are you that planners can grasp the nettle and address these challenges? If 5 is awesome.
5 is awesome?
Yeah.
4, I am optimistic, always optimistic about things. I think there's nothing that people can't solve if they put their mind and effort to it. And we just need to put our minds and our effort to it. We can do it. So I don't have any doubt that we can do it. The question is how much longer we need to go before we get into doing it. So always optimistic about solving things. I recall talking to my son who's now in his 20s about, he was pessimistic about the world, environmental damage, the world's going to... And I said, I meet people every day, particularly in last job in Moreton, who are inventing amazing environmental things so that, inventing stuff that helps our environment and helps business. And people are incredibly creative. So planners are supposed to be creative. On the whole, we are a very creative profession. So 4.5 out of 5.
4.5, yep. That's pretty good. So on that note, can you put your hands together to thank Greg? That's something to put the whistle and something for the architect within you. So
It's Lewis Keeble's book.
No, not quite. So thank you very much, Greg. Well, that's it from us. Happy World Cities Day, everyone, and we'll see you at World Town Planning Day in November. So keep it up. All right, thank you.